Right. Yes, they've let me back. I don't know what I did to deserve this. Some of you may have seen a version of this presentation before. I did it at UK North a couple of years ago and then repeated it at a LINX meeting. Bizarrely, this didn't put you all off. So this is from my time at the LINX. This is about 1997-ish. Yeah, so where were we then? So what were people buying? Well, lease lines were slow. 64K was kind of the 1 gig of the day. ISDN dial-up, and large phone bills. NNTP and Usenet, remember that? That was a bandwidth hog. UUCP, anybody still remember what it stands for? Anybody still use it? And, no prizes. And web hosting before Apache was a thing, which was fun and games as well. So, what were we doing? So the 25th birthday edition of this presentation, we had infrastructure headaches. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? What did the technical landscape look like? How did we scale above 100 meg? This was cutting-edge technology, people, and other fun things that occupied our time. And just to give you an idea of scale and things, the period this covers, the LINX comprised of initially 4 people, which was Keith, who had pretty much just started full-time. There was Carol, the office manager, who did her best to keep us all under control and did a sterling job at that. There was me and Jerry, who used to work at Telehouse, and he was an excellent practical joker. His most amusing thing he did that I can remember was getting somebody to go through the man traps in Telehouse North the wrong way, thus setting off a load of alarms and trapping this poor unsuspecting person in there. He then ran off up the goods lift out the way of the ensuing arguments. And shortly after that we hired Nick Lewis, who some of you will know, and he was sales. So there was a very small team back then, not like the large numbers we have now. A small aside though, digital archaeology is really hard work. Up there you can see 2 DDS2 tapes, one marked London and one marked Office. I do have these tapes. And a jazz drive. Now Keith really liked jazz drives, and we had these things everywhere. I dread to think if we'd ever needed to restore from one of them because they sort of made rattly noises and whirred a lot, but I don't really know if they actually stored anything or just made a happy noise. So I thought, oh yeah, I've got some primary reference material here. I'll try and find some hardware that can read this stuff, and eventually found some on eBay, and it whirred up, and yeah, it took 48 seconds to tell me that it wasn't going to go anywhere. So yeah, this is stuff that's, what, 22 years old. It's not ancient. You know, we've as a civilization have been writing things down for centuries that we can still read, and yet 20 years later I can't get a backup. I mean, of course, restoring backups is never a foregone conclusion, so perhaps we couldn't have restored them the day afterwards if we'd actually needed to. Yes, the one thing actually that has been very good is my old original SCSI IBM 1 gig hard drive from circa 1993, which is a little bit slow by today's standards, but at least will still plug into a modern SCSI card and is readable. So the moral of this story is if you've got stuff you want to keep, just keep it on spinning media and keep copying it from machine to machine. Although, of course, my penchant for never deleting any data is probably now going to be stymied by GDPR requirements, so unfortunately in 20 years' time we might not have all of this. So here's the slide that John likes to mock me for. And this was a long time ago, and at the time this made a lot of sense because the only real, it was the proper service providers who were LINX members back then. You didn't have any of the content providers. The BBC were about to be told no thank you, and you know, there weren't really the sort of the tier 2s. So exchange points. So the US had May East in Virginia, May West in California. They kind of fizzled out. They were on the decline at this point anyway. Europe, there was NetNode, LINX, DEKIX, AMZIX, all very young. And whatever you wanted, whether it was bandwidth, whether it was data center space, whether it was equipment, it was expensive. About the only thing that wasn't expensive, I guess, was the bar tab at socials, because there were fewer members. So what were we doing? 96, 97 tech. LINX was present in the original Telehouse. It was Telehouse, now Telehouse North. There were 3 Catalyst 1200s by the end of 1996. These were high-tech switches, the 10 meg ports, and 2 Cat 5Ks, which had 100 meg ports. Everything was interconnected with FIDI at 100 meg, and the high-performance 100 meg members, these were all on Cat 5Ks, because there weren't any other 100 meg ports. That is a Catalyst 1200. It's the Cisco switch that is in the Science Museum, which so enraged Cisco when we wanted to put that in the Science Museum that they refused to turn up for its internment. And that is a Catalyst 5000. Yes, the less said about them, the better, but they were good workhorses, even if they didn't work very well. And I know what you're all thinking. This was 25 years ago. Your home broadband is now faster than the LINX's backbone capacity. Unless, of course, you're on one of Neil's dodgy exchanges out in the sticks where they haven't got any decent high-speed broadband yet. He's not in here, I can say that. So these caused us quite a lot of problems. And what's interesting is the problems haven't changed with the years. IXPs were, and still are, a bit of an oddball edge case for the layer 2 switch vendors. They don't really understand this meshy nature of traffic flows. They still think very much of north-south with servers to clients, even now where we've got much more interconnected data centers. So we had challenges. The whole IXP fitted into a /23 of PI space with no IPv6. The peering LAN was a single /24. And the other /24 was divided up into a few odds and ends for the office, for infrastructure and things like that. It was all rather twee, wasn't it, really? And straight after I joined, we physically moved pretty much everybody from TFM2 up to a new suite, because the LINX up to this point was in 2 overflowing racks in a shared area. All of the members were moved, bar a few who were on 10 meg ports in this original location. This was a bit of a challenge. Some people weren't convinced about this at all. I'm not going to read this out, but this was like the technical newsletter of the day from the 25th of July, where it says, at midnight this Saturday, deep down in the chock-a-block Docklands Telehouse, where all of the UK ISP spaghetti meets, someone will have the unenviable task of unplugging the beating heart of the British net, the LINX, manhandling it into a side room which isn't quite as knee-high in cables, and then try and put it back together again. Nothing will go wrong. It goes on to say that if something did go wrong, you wouldn't know about it because the LINX would be down. Actually, it went surprisingly well. As I'm sure these things happen today, everything's pre-patched. You just move both ends of the cables, and after a night of Jerry and I running around Telehouse, it all came together. I don't think moving the entire exchange these days at the same time would be a very good idea. So I found some slides from LINX17. LINX17 was 90 meetings ago, 22 years ago this month. What exciting technical innovations had we got? Brace yourselves, people. I updated the mail server. We installed Major Domo, remember that? Up till this point, things like the ops list were literally just a Unix alias expansion that was quite unwieldy and ran to several lines in the aliases file. And members could do things like add and update their subscriptions. This was cutting-edge stuff. We implemented some stats. We implemented MRTG, that stalwart of stats from the ages, individual member stats and aggregate stats, and root name server stats. And we gained a looking glass. I'll come back to these lovely slides. We added a looking glass for people. Yeah, the slides basically got extracted from a PowerPoint presentation that I'd saved as HTML. Microsoft were even worse at this 22 years ago than they are now, so that's why these slides are in such shocking condition. And we configured some monitoring. Isn't it really twee that, I said, well, what we do is we actually ping the members' routers just to make sure they're still there. Oh, and we'd ping the switches too to make sure they're still there. What's quite interesting with this, it seems really, really quaint, but the LINX was kind of moving from that bit of an experiment to this is actually a production level network, and it actually requires some production level stuff. I mean, the other thing to remember that back now, sort of late 1990s, there were lots of early adopters, and you could get away with things going down for a while, but people were starting to use the internet for real stuff, even though it was obviously nothing like it was today. So this was basically just growing pains of getting things up to a standard that you'd expect. So other things of note was that we thought we might be running out of address space. We needed more, so we applied to become an LIR in October 97. We're anxiously awaiting that /19. Do you remember those heady days when RIPE had /19s to give out to new LIRs? Oh, it was a good time to be alive. So what we had to do is we had to do some upgrades because the hardware wasn't up to it. There's the thing. It's a recurring theme, this, isn't it? By 1998, we'd added 2 Planetree 4800 FDDI switches. That's actually the 9600. So if you imagine a chassis that was half that size. Now, these switches were a little bit troublesome. They were great in the lab when we tested them, but what we didn't really appreciate was that their CLI was rubbish. And when I say rubbish, I mean that the basic commands were SNMP set and SNMP get, and you basically drove these things by ruining at their SNMP from their own command line. Not a great look. And we had so many problems with them when they were actually in production that in a moment of, let's say, a fit of pique, I told our account manager, unless they sorted it out, I was going to invite the computing press and throw them off the roof of Telehouse into the moat. So some of you might remember that where there's currently car parking in the front of Telehouse North, that used to be a sort of lake pond thing, sort of shallow water feature, which I'm sure would have attracted their attention. They did come and fix them, but they didn't last long. So this is what it looked like, stolen from Keith's Nanog 15 presentation. We had a core 100 meg FIDI ring with the plane trees and a Cat 5K. I don't know why we've only got one Cat 5K on this diagram, but hey-ho. And a few Cat 1200s scattered around. And typically the way this would work is a large member would have 100 meg connection as their primary and maybe a 10 meg connection as the backup. Smaller members might have a single 10 meg connection, which was plenty fast enough for small members in those days. Big dependency on that central 100 meg ring. So we had the issue that has been repeated in the past after this, of the fastest connection we're offering to members was actually the backbone speed, and this is never a great place to be. Here's the obligatory stats graph. Now, this would be up and to the right, but if you remember way back then, original versions of MRTG somehow, for some reason, put now. So this is actually sort of now. So it's sort of up and to the right, but to the left. So obviously the stat system fell over sometime in May, but we gloss over those things. And there's a little bit of a problem here in November, which I'll come back to. The joining process. Yeah, the joining process was interesting. A bit counterproductive, the infamous 4 trace routes requirement. Basically, as a new member, you had to embarrass yourself in front of the entire rest of the membership by submitting 4 trace routes to root name servers from your network that proved that you had your own international connectivity. What this basically did is excluded all the content providers, all the people who bought transit from a UK ISP who was also a LINX member, which was all of the big ones, and the BBC. And Simon did an excellent presentation at LINX100 about the fun and games that they had for joining. This kind of led directly to the formation of LONAP, where, and I say this without any disparagement meant, the tier 2s of the UK could happily exchange traffic. And I have to say that back then there was certainly not the cooperation between LINX and LONAP, which there is now, and I think we were all the poorer for it. The 100 meg FIDI interconnect was way too limiting. Members were asking about 1 gig. 1 gig Ethernet was here to stay. So we went out to look at some new switches. And after some interesting trips around the States, we elected to get the Packet Engines Power Rail series and the Extremes. The Power Rails also did FIDI. We had like 2 or 3 big members who were big FIDI users, which was why we kept having it, and it had to stay. And I would have been quite happy for it to go, but there you go. We were going to have it, come hell or high water. So we got these switches. That was the first Power Rail 5200 in the LINX. It was a mixture of 10100 ports, 1 gig FIDI ports. The hardware on these devices was well ahead of their time and well ahead of the software they ran. They were quite expensive per port, but it was massively flexible. Unfortunately, they were acquired by Alcatel, and I think a lot of that goodness slowed down. I think some of the good people left at that point, which was a real shame because they definitely had potential. It will come as no surprise to people to learn that I actually have one of these switches in my garage, and I did contemplate bringing it today, but decided that it was too big and too heavy for the train. Extreme, yep, they're still going strong and still had a presence at LON 2 until recently. That Summit 48 that's hidden behind that rat's nest of cables was the first Summit 48 that went live in the LINX. And I also found, too late to go into this presentation, a wonderful photo of that switch from the New Year LAN party I did with some friends in 97, 98, where we used that Summit 48 to play Quake or whatever LAN party game we were playing. And one of my friends said, wow, this is so much faster than the normal Ethernet we use. You know, I need to get one of these switches. I'm going, you don't want to buy one of those switches. That's like a 5-figure sum. But it was well exercised. You know, we had to test these things. So as part of the upgrade, we had a bit of a problem because FIDI had inherent protection. It was a ring. GigE didn't. And there were large debates that raged in the LINX office, full and frank exchanges of technical viewpoints, I think, what Keith and I might describe them as. I think the rest of the office would probably call it a flaming row, where they hid behind their laptops and pretended to be anywhere but there. It was quite interesting. I think when we did have interesting clashes of views, Keith and I would generally retreat, sulk for about half an hour, and then begrudgingly admit that the other person might have had a point after all. It led to good architectural compromise. What we actually did with Spanning Tree was decided that we didn't want it anywhere near the exchange, and it was generally safer not to run it and to manually bring interfaces up if necessary, which kind of worked. So when we did this upgrade to a gig, wasn't a fantastic success. That first weekend of November, remember the gap in the stats? Mm-hmm. So it was a very long day, a very long night followed by a very long day where pretty much everything was down, and it made the national press. We have our suspicions as to which person who I won't mention might have leaked it to the national press. He's not in the room anymore. No. He might have been named after Neil Armstrong, I learnt today. So I broke the LINX for 12 hours. It didn't even make Need to Know, which was being very complimentary about our moving of the LINX a few months before. It did underline a recurring theme, and a recurring theme that's still true today, which was the switch vendors really don't quite get internet exchanges. They get them far more now than they ever did. You'd try the hardware in the lab, you'd try it with your Ixias, you'd really give it a good thrashing, and it would sit there and go, yep, I'm really good, I'm great for purpose. You'd send it live, and that would be it. And then the ops list would explode. So, addressing. As I said, we had a /23 of PI space back then. Much too small. That /19 turned up from RIPE, and we had to renumber the peering LAN. This was the first great renumbering. That's as much fun as moving. What I did discover, though, is I found this text file that you might not be able to read very well, because I was really concerned when you had to renumber a second time that I'd not left enough space, but actually I'd reserved a /21 for the peering LANs from day one, so I'm afraid the second renumbering is definitely Mike's fault, not mine. Other things that we gained some key infrastructure. We had the original k.rootservers.net, which we hosted for the RIPE NCC. That was the original k-root, or one of the two of them. We had the .uk primary name server, ns0.nic.uk. Having these two, ignore the jars of Marmite, it's a joke. And I haven't got time to go into that now. Having the name servers was quite interesting because we could do some analysis of DNS traffic. Levels were quite low, 2 megaseconds out from k.root at that time, 150k from NS0. Looking at the queries and the responses, for operational reasons, of course, was actually very enlightening. I can't imagine that this has got any better today, but basically 19% of requests to k.root were an NX domain reply, basically from Windows machines trying to look up their workgroup name. And 6% of queries came from RFC 1918 space, so I'm not quite sure where they were expecting to go back to. The other thing that we did was went multi-site. In the new, as it was then, Red Bus Interhouse building, Bonington House on Mill Harbour, that went through various names and is now Digital Realty LHR 19. There was dark fibre there between Bonington and North, and LINX and AMSIX both kind of went multi-site at the same time. So we sort of, depending on exactly what metric you use, I think defines which one of us won. And I think both exchanges claim that particular crown. Talking about data centres, well, the London scene was pretty thin. Telehouse North was the only telehouse, but an awful lot of that building was still dealing room disaster recovery space. It wasn't facilities managed space as we know it now. Metro had recently opened in the city, and obviously Bonington House had opened on Mill Harbour. There wasn't much else elsewhere. The original Telly City in Williams had opened in Manchester, but that was pretty much the only public space available there. There were provider-specific buildings. You know, the big telcos generally would have a building, but they were still seen very much as single occupancy computer centres. They weren't what we would, they're what we would call a data centre, but they weren't really available for, you could go and just rent a rack space and rent some power. Connectivity had its own fun and games. Ethernet wasn't, the de facto standard that it is today. WANs were very much still ATM, frame relay, packet over SONET. Typical speeds were 155 or 622, or starting to emerge was 2.4 gig for backbones. And 2 meg was considered to be a high-speed customer connection. Even on the LAN, Ethernet and IP wasn't a given. FIDI and Token Ring were still very much in use in enterprise. They were expensive, but they had their benefits. And on the LAN itself, you were equally likely to find AppleTalk, IPX, NetBEUI, and other bizarre protocols that used to be beloved by CCIE question setters. We did have some light-hearted moments as well. I remember a LINX meeting where I got so fed up with some of the rubbish that people's routers were spouting out onto the peering LAN that I started doing a presentation like this and just ran a live TCP dump from one of the machines that we had sitting on the peering LAN. And gradually, the rate of packets per second would slow down for the not IP packets as people spotted their MAC addresses and frantically reconfigured their routers. By the end of the presentation, it's like, that's really good. So I think, though, with the number of members and devices on the LAN today, you just wouldn't be able to even see your MAC address going up, let alone act on it. Shortly after a move, there was a member who shall remain nameless. They were basically caught without any international connectivity. What they did is they brought up GRE tunnels over other members' connections to the US, and then basically statically routed default down those. When confronted with what could only be described as pretty overwhelming evidence of this, the defense was that Paul had reconnected two Cat5 cables the wrong way round, so the packets had gone the wrong way, and this was why this was happening. And annoyingly, their customers seemed to buy this. The LINX membership didn't buy it, and I think at the next EGM they were shown the door. The other fun thing that we did was we hosted RIPE 31 in Edinburgh. That was the first of 3 LINX RIPE meetings that the LINX had hosted. You'd think we'd actually have learnt not to do this. Our livers wish we'd never done this. And the connectivity for this was provided by the LINX, but obviously it was in Edinburgh. Janet had plenty of high-speed connectivity in Edinburgh, so we built a GRE tunnel. Basically, everything seemed to be GRE tunnels, didn't it? We built a GRE tunnel and we sent a full BGP session down it. However, the next hop for this BGP peer was learnt over the peering session. So it was kind of bootstrapped into existence, but we then never dared restart the router. And I remember sitting next to Alex Bly, and I had Randy Bush sitting behind me, and whenever he cussed and hit return very hard, Alex and I would descend onto our laptops just to make sure that the connectivity was still up. Luckily, it stayed up, and we had a good write meeting. And that is about it. And if I'm here in 25 years' time, please shoo me off the stage and tell me to shut up. If anybody has any questions, oh God.
I've not got a question, I've got correction. I have consulted sources.
Oh dear.
Being senior, very senior
IRC.
Network engineers.
IRC.
And no, these days it's Teams. You ascribed Bonington to be Redbus, and we're pretty sure it was Telecity.
Wasn't it? I'm sure it was Redbus first.
No, I wasn't there, so I had to consult sources, but we believe it was Telecity.
Ah, I have been caught out.
Yes.
Right.
We can pick holes in the rest of the slides, Paul, but it'll take a while. Yeah?
Do you want me to go back? Any you particularly like to choose?
No, seriously, that was brilliant. Thank you.
It was actually. I mean, the LINX are still in the same suite in Bonington. That was a fun exercise going in there. Any more for any more? I appreciate that I'm holding you up, and you can't go home until I get off the stage, so I could just stand here while you throw rotten eggs.
Any more for any more?
Run away.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Thanks.